In other words, it stems from differences in ideas, definitions, perceptions, or goals. So, my idea about something is this, and your idea about something is this, and we just differ on that. Same thing with definitions. Remember, experience plays a huge role in our definitions of things, our perceptions of things, our goals. So, my experience has been one thing, and I understand something to mean this, and your experiences have indicated that that means this. And, we talked about different words and how you might define what you grill on, what meat you grill, hot dogs or whatever you call them. I call them hot dogs, but, brats or wieners or whatever. Depending on where you're from and your experiences, you're going to define things differently. And perceptions and goals. So again, we're not necessarily at a negative conflict, it's just a difference in opinion. You understand each other, you just agree. So you're able to look at the other person and say, I see where you're coming from, I understand your point of view, I just have a different one. And the key is to keep conversation focused on the issues rather than the personalities. Because as soon as it goes into personalities, I think that you're silly for thinking that way, or, well, of course you feel that because you, etc., etc., etc. Notice that when we focus on the person, the traits or the characteristics of that person, then we go into more of a defensive climate. So if we keep it on the conversation, the topic at hand, so, I believe this about politics and you believe this about politics, we can agree to disagree, and we're going to focus on the politics rather than, what I think about the fact that you think something else. Okay, so quick little break of humor for you. Hey Dad, how do you and Mom manage to work out your little disagreements? He asks, and he says, well, son, actually we never have any little disagreements to work out. And the wife comes out from the side and says, due to, and then they go into a little argument about not having arguments. And I think often we don't think of certain contexts as disagreements or arguments or conflicts. I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, just saying yes we do, no we don't, that's not really a conflict. But again, remember, even a simple difference of opinion qualifies. So if we're thinking about strategies to handle simple conflict, so remember, simple conflict, you agree to disagree, you understand where the other person is coming from, you just maintain your own opinion. So how to handle this? Clarify you and your partner's understanding of the issues. So, the phrase, just the facts, ma'am, that's very simple and easy to remember. So stay focused on the issue, the topic at hand, and clarify what you believe and what your other person believes and what you understand about each other's beliefs. Keep the discussion focused on the facts, like I mentioned. Look for more than the initial solutions. Because simple conflict is not necessarily negative, there's probably a very easy early solution that may come up, but sometimes it's easier to look for something other than that. Don't try to tackle too many issues at once. So, you may have several things you disagree on, and trying to address all of them at once is probably going to mean that you end up in a true conflict. So try to handle one thing at a time, keep it simple, keep it focused, and find a kernel of truth in what your partner is saying. In other words, you can probably find a level of common ground no matter what the topic is, no matter what the issue is. I happen to be in a course right now that the professor and I are very, very different in what we believe about the world, and we have worked in our class to find common ground and find things that we can agree on, even though there are many, many things that we don't agree on. So find a kernel of truth in what the other person is saying. I guarantee you can find something that you can agree on, even if there's the majority that you don't. And if tempers flare and conflict escalates, take a break, step back, and cool off. Return when your mind is clear. When I train parents in my filial therapy, which is basically teaching parents to do play therapy with their own children, one of the rules of thumb that we talk about is when a child is drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. And the principle there is that if your child is drowning, meaning your child is in the thick of the issue, that's not when they are receptive to instruction and help and all of those things. They need to be removed from the immediate problem before you can do anything further. So again, if you're in a situation where the conflict is getting worse and escalating, that's not the time to try to fix it or address it. Give yourself a break, cool off, and then when your mind is not so focused on the issue, then you can come back and readdress the topic, etc. Okay, so then ego conflict is kind of the third level. So pseudo conflict is just a misunderstanding, simple conflict is kind of in the middle, and then ego conflict is when the conflict gets personal. Personal attacks put partner on the defensive, and that goes back to using I statements instead of you statements and blaming statements. And of course, as each person becomes more defensive, the conflict escalates. That makes sense. And it occurs when participants begin attacking each other instead of the issue at hand or bringing up sensitive issues. Remember, we talked about the red flags and our trigger words. Some people say, they're pushing my buttons. Those are all ways that we communicate. You're bringing up something that is a sensitive issue or something that's going to create a response in me, a reaction in me. And so bringing up sensitive issues is, kind of a tried and true way of having things turn into an ego conflict. Also, if you begin attacking each other, remember we talked about the strategies of keeping it focused on the issue, not the personality. Well, same here. If you're not attacking the other person, you have a much more supportive climate rather than a defensive, antagonistic climate. So strategies to deal with ego conflict. Really, this seems very basic and intuitive, but steer the ego conflict back to a simple conflict. That's your guaranteed method for not letting it go too far out of your control. If you notice that things are starting to get toward the ego conflict where it's personal attacks and very defensive, stay focused on the issues instead. So, one of the things that I happen to say, probably because I've been trained as a therapist, I might say, what I hear you saying is, and I paraphrase back what I think they're trying to communicate, and then I try to redirect back to the original topic, which would be staying focused on the issues, which again prevents the personal attacks. This is an interesting thought because I don't think we often consider this idea, but make the issue a problem to be solved, not a battle to be won. And I think when we're in conflict, that instinctive fight or flight mechanism that triggers, if we are willing to stay and get into a conflict, then that means that our fight trigger is going. And so that, I have to win this battle is very instinctual, and it's very, almost innate. And so if we can think about this as a problem that needs to be solved, so when you are creating a solution to a problem, you're looking at options, you're considering the elements, you're possibly collaborating. So not thinking about it in terms of this is a battle that I have to win, but let's figure out how to fix this. It's a very different perception of the situation. Another topic that you may be interested in is writing down what you want to say, especially if you're one of those people that after every major conflict in your life, you sit there and say, oh, if only I would have said this at the time, or if only I would have done this in that moment. If you're that person, you may benefit from writing down what you want to say, because in the moment it can be very difficult to communicate effectively and express yourself and your feelings in a healthy way. So sometimes if you write it down, that gives you the opportunity to edit it and to think about it and to process it and make sure that it's truly exactly what you want to communicate. Here are my caveats though. Do not put angry attacks in writing. So if you're going to write down what you want to say, that's not the time to express your anger or attack the other person. Make the written summary rational, logical, and brief. So another rule of thumb that we use when I train parents is if you can't say it in 10 words or less, don't say it. And especially in a conflict situation, that might be near impossible to keep it under 10 words, but the concept is still there. The more concise and to the point and clear and brief you can be, obviously when there's a sensitive issue, when there's something that, both people have investment in the issue and they both have their own feelings and their own perceptions and their own ideas about things, you have that automatically all playing in, right? And so the more, you don't want to listen to somebody blabber on and on and on when you're already kind of heated about the topic to begin with. So the meaning of your message gets lost the more words you use. So try to be very brief and try to be rational and logical. If you have a viewpoint and if you have a belief on something, explain it rationally and logically. This is why I believe what I do. This is where I'm coming from, and keep it short. When things get personal, do not reciprocate. I know, easier said than done, but an easy way to do that, use I messages instead of you. And as a side note, my husband tells me the other day, I'm actually using I statements a lot now. I use I statements all the time. And I was like, oh, look at that. Okay, so I have a couple of food for thought questions for you. Is it ethical and or appropriate to mask your true emotions in order to get along with others? So ponder that for one moment. Is it ethical or appropriate to mask your true emotions, how you really feel, in order to get along with others? And then secondly, is honesty in a relationship always the best policy? I probably shouldn't have accentuated that word because now you know what the answer is, but is honesty in a relationship the best policy? And then, are there situations in which you should not assert your point of view? Would there be a certain place where what you think should not be communicated? And what would be an example of that? So if you can choose one of those questions and put that in your reflection post, I'd be interested to read those. So, ethical or appropriate to mask your true emotions in order to get along? Is honesty in a relationship the best policy? And are there situations in which you should not assert your point of view? So choose one of those and include that in your reflection post. So if we've looked at the types of conflict, we've looked at strategies for managing those types of conflicts, we've looked at what conflict is, but if we consider conflict as a process, remember we looked at a conversation as a process as well. So if we can consider conflict as a process, it gives us almost step-by-step elements that we can focus on and kind of work with. So most relational disagreements have a source, a beginning, a middle, an end, and an aftermath. And if you think back to the steps of a conversation, we have the greeting, the priming, topic priming, etc. So almost the same idea here, but it's specific to conflict now. So let's look at these components. Okay, the source of the conflict is first. Basically, the prior conditions leading up to that conversation. So you're setting the stage for the disagreement in the source component. So what has led up to that point? What prior conditions existed? What things have already been brought to the table before we even get to the true conflict? So this is when you become aware that there are differences between you and the other person. The first instance where you think, we just don't see eye to eye on this. It can come from role expectations. So, I thought that you were going to do this because that's my experience. Your role would be this and my role would be that. Or it could be a perception or a goal or a resource issue. And sometimes determining the source means that you have to look at more than one element. So it may consist of multiple sources. So there may be 3 or 4 prior conditions that are all coming together to set the stage for the disagreement. Okay, so then you have the active conflict. This is the middle, the meat and potatoes of the conflict. That's my brother's phrase, but the active conflict means the frustration is being brought to the attention of others. So, I'm communicating that I'm frustrated, you're telling me that you're frustrated. We now know that where the other person stands. It becomes an active conflict. However, it's not necessarily emotionally intense. So the middle of the conflict is not necessarily when the tempers are flaring and the emotions are going. Sometimes it's just